if I can go that long. But I can if you have questions, so just let me know. If you're out of questions...
You go till 3:40.
Sorry?
3:40.
3:40? Okay, well, yeah. I can keep rambling, I can keep answering questions. Absolutely. How about I pass the pieces of the sword around? If you promise not to break this, you can look at it closely. I'm going to set this down for a second. You guys can check out the apps. Yeah. If you look at it, it just kind of has some puzzle pieces. It's kind of asymmetrical, so it fits better. Yeah. You can pass them back to the back if you want. Just don't run off. I will find you. It's not very fragile either. You can drop it. It's okay. Yeah, I made that big sword out of just Avafoam because it's very lightweight and flexible. So I'm not too worried about it bumping into things. Over time, it will wear off and like get damaged, but overall, it's a pretty resilient material and it's super cheap comparatively. So I like to work with it a lot for props. It's actually made out of 4 layers of Avafoam. I glued them all together and then really tightly together, and then took it to a belt sander for the edges. Then I applied extra layers for the details. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, in the front. Armor for a little chickie? Yeah. Use the craft foam. Craft foam is Avafoam, but it's like paper thin almost. It's just like 2 or 3 millimeters thick, and you can get it at Joann's, or I think Hobby Lobby has it too. They come in little packets in the crafting section. They're usually different colors like black, yellow, red, green, but it's still Avafoam, and you can still use it for armor. You just have to make a little pattern for your little chickie. Yes? It depends on what the weapon is. If you're making like a samurai sword, something really slender and thin, then you might not worry about PVC pipe necessarily. You could just make it out of wood. There's different kinds of wood that work well. I think some people make props with balsa wood. It's kind of a lighter weight, softer wood, but it is a little more fragile because of that. So it depends on what you're wanting to make. If you're making bigger props, I always recommend using a PVC pipe. Behind you.
Is there a specific kind of glue that you use with the foam?
A specific kind of glue with the foam? With Avafoam, there's 3 different kinds of glues that I like the most. Actually, I would say 4. Hot glue is your last minute, not so great fix. It does work well with Avafoam, but it's likely to pull apart later, and it's also a bit messy. But it's super, super cheap and quick to fix in a hotel, so I tend to go to hot glue pretty often, probably more than I should. But super glue also works, but it's a little brittle, but if you're not worried about your prop moving much, then it's quick to bond. So it's also kind of a quick fix one. It's more pricey because it only comes in those teeny tiny tubes. Third, and probably best, would be the contact cement. That stuff comes in like big cans, and it's pretty cheap. But it produces fumes, so make sure that you're either outside or in a very well ventilated area when you use it. And what you do is you coat both surfaces that you're going to bond together and let them set for like about 15 minutes or so. Depends on the brand, I think, but more or less 15 minutes. And then you stick them together, and it's just, it's one thing now. Some people also use E6000 or Gorilla Glue. There's a few different glues that work with Avafoam. A lot of it comes down to letting it seep into the foam, because it's kind of spongy, so it'll soak it up. And that creates a really good bond for it. Yes? Pattern making. I really should have had just a pattern making panel by itself, because that's kind of my specialty. Honestly, patterning, there's just so much to do with patterning. What I would say to start with is get yourself some plastic wrap or Glad press and seal or something like that you can wrap around your body, and or like in tape and stuff to just wrap around your. Let's take my arm for example. So you'd wrap around some Glad press and seal or some plastic wrap and make a basic shape of what you're wanting to make, like a gauntlet or something. Then cut that open where you want the seam to be. If you look at real armor, fantasy armor doesn't always have seams, so you have to get creative and kind of hide them under things. But if you look at real armor, you'll see that like they have functional seam lines where they open and close. And usually there's like leather straps holding them shut. But in fantasy armor, like this one for example, it doesn't really have a seam, it just has 2 layers. So I put the seam for the underpiece on the top, and then the top piece goes over that so that it's hidden really well. And it looks like it's starting to come apart a little bit, but I had them completely bonded together and I just slide my hand through. So it's kind of tight, but it does fit pretty well. But to get those patterns figured out, first cut the plastic wrap open and lay it flat and draw your pattern on top of that. If you've got a really good artistic eye for patterning, which you'll kind of figure out as you practice, you might feel like it comes to you naturally, and that's great. But if it doesn't, just keep practicing. Take note of basic shapes, because you'll find that a lot of patterns are pretty basic shapes, like trapezoid squares, which are like, you know what a trapezoid is, right? Everybody knows what a trapezoid is? Look it up if you don't. Trapezoids, circles, spheres, triangles. Lots of triangles on mine, and you're just kind of combining shapes to figure out the pattern. When I'm trying to figure out proportions for patterns, which I think a lot of people get stuck with, or they find out after they've already made the thing that it doesn't look quite right. I like to use parts of my own body as measurements. So if you're looking at the reference picture and you see that the sections of the arm piece are like about the same length as your knuckle to the tip of your finger, just small guidelines. It may seem weird, but it works really well. And a lot of times I'll use from my wrist to my elbow as a measurement piece because it's pretty consistent. I'll use my head as a measurement, like the width of my head or the height of my head. I mean, that's actually what artists do when they're drawing people, is they go with head heights rather than actual foot measurements. Yeah, pauldrons are a little more difficult to figure out. Even I'm still kind of learning with pauldron shapes, but usually I would start by making kind of a basic dome shape. It depends on how domey the pauldron is, because some pauldrons are really dome shaped and some are kind of more ovular, some are more boxy. So kind of break it down into basic shapes again and kind of figure it out a little bit at a time. I usually have a lot of trial and error with patterns, and I always make mock-ups out of really cheap materials like cardboard or just stiff paper and try them on as is. And I try to move around in those patterns, because if the pattern tears, or the tape that's holding the pattern together tears, then that means that it doesn't fit me quite right. So if you get the armor to fit pretty well and it's not tearing too much, it's not like restricting your movement too much. I was kind of rushing this one a little bit, and like, not a whole lot, but just certain parts of it I could have fine-tuned just that little bit more, and I might have had just a little more arm movement in the front. This torso piece is a little boxy, so I can't really move my arms quite as far forward as I wish I could. So, even if I'd had more time, I could have perfected this just a little bit more. But I was also trying to stick to the accuracy of the armor itself, which was unrealistic, because if you ever look at video game characters, their animations are awful. They get a lot of clips which is where their arm's going through their armor or vice versa. And that's one thing that you have to kind of figure out when you're working with certain designs, is that the creator of the armor wasn't worried about how it actually works in real life, because the render doesn't have solid, flesh. They're just, they're fake. So the armor can go all the way through their flesh and it doesn't look bad because it's rendered. So yeah, you have to kind of dang it, I'll fix that later. You have to just figure out slight adjustments to the armor shapes to account for actual body movement sometimes. You in the back.
Whenever you have a larger cosplay that doesn't quite fit into your size, how do you support such a armor?
Armor that is outside of the proportions of your normal body. I feel like a lot of that comes down to catering to your own personal body shape. And no matter what you look like in regards to the character, I think the best way to figure out the differences between you and what you're trying to cosplay is to create a comparison image. And what I like to do personally is, if you go to the Adobe website, they make Photoshop. They have a free version that you can download. It's CS2. It's a really older version. I used it in college. It's not bad though. And it allows you to create layered images by just like putting a bunch of pictures into the Photoshop file. And on the lower right, there's an area that says layers. And if you look up some super basic tutorials on how to work with layers, you can basically put a reference image of your character and a reference image of you in the same angle and positioning as the character, and overlay the two. If you put the layers on top of each other, you can change the settings on the top layer so that the opacity is lower, which means that it's kind of transparent, you can see through it a little bit, and you can put them directly on top of each other. Then you can visibly see the differences between you and the costume that you're trying to make. You do have to think about the scaling of the images and kind of resize them so they look about the right size compared to each other. But if you do that, then I find that extremely helpful in visualizing the differences. If you can't do that, or you're not comfortable with working with Photoshop because you haven't done it before, a similar thing that you can do is just print out pictures of yourself and the character in the same pose and the same angle. Try to scale the images before you print them out so that they're close to the same size, or so that it's the size that you want to become. So say like you're doing a mascot and you want to be really big. Print the image larger than you, or overlay it in Photoshop larger than you, so that you'll know to account for that size difference when you're making the costume. As far as actually constructing it to be bigger than you, that usually you can use like fillers, like foams, and just layers of different materials to account for that size difference. If you're a bigger person and you're trying to cosplay a smaller character, then you have to do kind of the opposite. You have to stretch out the proportions of the costume you're trying to make to account for your own size. And that's not a problem at all. That's still part of the process, really. But you have to. I still think that the overlay is helpful for that, because one way or another you'll see the differences in the sizes between the two. You'll be able to kind of account for that and pattern it out. Then you go back to plastic wrapping yourself. Another thing you can do if you want to try patterning on just a flat surface is you can do an outline of your body, or just an outline of your arm, or whatever you're doing. Add a couple of inches to the edges of that, and that's basically kind of a half shape of your body piece that you can kind of draw on and create patterns based off of, and then you kind of double that to make the pattern go all the way around. Because like a lot of pattern pieces have side seams basically, so they only go around half of your arm or body or whatever anyway. So that's what I like to do a lot, because I can see things pretty flat. I've got a lot of practice in just kind of visualizing the curves and stuff, and over time I think you'll figure that out as you go. But if you look at existing patterns on fabrics, you'll see that to get curves and stuff, there'll be seams will have curves to them where the seam lines are. They'll also have darts that help create extra seams without going fully through the material. And some of that with armor can be made with stretch instead of with darts. But a lot of it can also be translated from a dart to a different layer. So like if you're looking at this, there's a lot of different layers in this, and I was able to account for where it expands outward with those different layers by just, first I draw it flat as just a single piece. Then when I'm breaking it apart into different layers, I'll redraw some of them just